Floodplain Permitting and Ordinance Administration. My name is Matt Bauman, and I'm with the Floodplain Program, as well as our shoreland and our other river-specific land use programs in the DNR. With me today is Seal Strauss, who's my lead worker on the floodplain side of things. Prior to my time with the DNR, my background was that at the local level, and like many attending today, we just didn't confront a lot of development in the floodplain. And whether you're a community that's in the Red River Valley or like a lot of us, with just maybe a small portion of our community is in floodplain, the permitting requirements and expectations for zoning administrators are the same. The floodplain program has a ton of complexities, and each local government is expected to ensure development is compliant with our state standards as well as our federal standards. And I mean, really, we understand that no local zoning administrator is expected to have all the answers, but you should know the basics, and hopefully this training, along with the others we're offering, at least gives you an idea where to look for answers and the types of questions that might require some level of DNR engagement, whether it's Seal, myself, or your local area hydrologist. And we want you to reach out to us. One of our primary responsibilities is to provide that technical assistance. Roles and responsibilities. So the permitting authority is whoever has that zoning authority, whoever has adopted that floodplain ordinance. And it's typically a city or a county, but there's a handful of townships that have taken on floodplain zoning authority as well. And when those communities take on that authority, they formally enroll in the National Flood Insurance Program that involves an application, adoption of a resolution, and adoption of an effective ordinance. Local zoning administrator, you assist residents, you issue permits, you do inspections and record keeping. And you know, within your community, it's important to understand who is the floodplain administrator. Your community might be a big one, and you might employ a full-time water resources person or an engineer. Perhaps your primary contact is the local zoning administrator, or maybe it's just a part-time town clerk, like a lot of our very small communities. You know, you might have a consulting engineer that you work with or a consulting planner that you work with. Regardless, it's important to at least have one person that knows how to read a floodplain map and knows what questions to ask. You're also the first point of contact for the property owner, and you need to be able to communicate risk as well as different alternatives that might be available on the front end of that permitting process. A lot of parts of the state have a watershed district, and most of our watershed districts are regulatory bodies, so they have the ability to adopt regulations of their own. And a lot of these regulations might touch on floodplain standards. So where a local community may not have higher standards, the watershed district might adopt a freeboard standard, or they might adopt a compensatory storage standard or something like that. They might be spearheading mitigation projects within your community, and they have a lot of qualified staff, and they can often serve as resources for that local community. The state, Seal, myself, other folks at the state, we provide technical assistance, we provide training, like the training here. We're statutorily required to approve ordinances, review and approve ordinances. And there's also a monitoring component as well. We're statutorily required to monitor local communities' compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. And FEMA has a monitoring requirement as well. They call it an audit. And we also call them community assistance contacts. That's typically just a phone call, or lately it's been a Teams call. as well as community assistant visits. And those contacts or visits, we might dig into the types of permitting that you've been confronting. If you've had a particularly challenging permit that you've processed, we might walk you through that process and your standard operating procedures at the local, just to give you a little bit more one-on-one. FEMA also has a role there. They oversee the entire national flood insurance program, your mapping components, your regulatory components, flood insurance as well. They're involved with all of that. Now, what types of development require a permit? Development is what requires a permit. Development is defined in your ordinance, and it's defined broadly. It's structures, it's earth moving, fences, roadways, culverts, bridges, really anything that's moving dirt in the floodplain by and large. I also put on there additions as well as restorations and repairs. And these are kind of different because these involve alterations to existing non-conforming structures. Additions are limited in floodplain areas. Non-conforming structures aren't allowed to expand. There's limitations on that expansion, and the rationale behind that is we want to limit exposure to risk within our floodplain areas. Damages as well. When a flood event comes through, there's a huge permitting demand on that local zoning administrator. And when a structure is considered to be substantially damaged, that's when the damage exceeds 50% of the structure's value, the property owner is required to bring that structure into compliance. So there's a standard evaluation methodology that we recommend zoning administrators employ during that post-disaster period to determine that 50% category. Those second two bullets are a big part of permitting, and that's why I'm putting it in here. But back to that definition of development, and here's a portion of that definition on the screen now. And like I said, it's defined very broadly, and it's any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including buildings, structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, drilling operations, or storage of equipment or materials. You know, it's very all-encompassing. You know, dirt moving, bridges, culverts, roads, shoreline stabilization. These are all types of development. They all require a permit and at least some level of analysis. What type of permit is required? You might have a building permit, and you can roll the applicable floodplain regulations into your normal building permit process. You might have a separate land alterations permit if the person is just moving dirt. You might choose to adopt a specific floodplain permit. When the development is in floodplain, maybe that triggers a floodplain permit. Really, we don't care what type of permit it is. It just requires a permit. And on that, you know, our typical development happens near water. And when a project is solely or partially below the ordinary high water level, that triggers, that's under the DNR's jurisdiction. So a DNR permit would typically be required in those types of situations. Like if it's a culvert or a bridge, a DNR permit would be required in those types of situations. However, if a significant portion of that same project is above the ordinary high water level, a local permit would also be required because it might trigger evaluation of other parts of your floodplain ordinance, or it might trigger sections of your shoreland ordinance or other ordinances that you may have as well. A lot of the activities that require a permit might seem insignificant and wouldn't otherwise trigger a permit for you. And that's okay. You know, you want to, you know, you don't want to make it too burdensome where it's too big of a deal to obtain that permit. You know, when you're talking about fee schedules, you know, maybe that's an annual thing for your community. Maybe it's appropriate to consider waiving fees for development that wouldn't otherwise require a permit. On our website, we have a sample permit application form, and there's two versions of this form. There's a full version, which is a 5-pager, and then there's a simplified version when a development does not involve a structure, and that's a 3-pager. And, it details the relevant standards that you'd typically be confronting in a floodplain development. And, if you follow this document, it'll ensure that you're hitting, 80 or 90% of the items that you need to be looking at for processing a permit. And I'll get more into this document later on in the presentation. When is no permit needed? This has been further clarified in the newest model ordinance that we've put out. It talks about routine maintenance, continuation of existing uses that had gotten a permit a while ago. And then FEMA details when a permit isn't needed, and they talk about insignificant uses that will not create obstructions or have an impact on flood flows, such as planting a garden, farming, or putting up a mailbox. So, it kind of leaves it up to the zoning administrator what you're going to consider an insignificant use. But it offers those examples. When in doubt, it should be permitted, to ensure that any activities which have the potential to impact the floodplain are being permitted. Here's another example of when a permit might not be needed. Our ordinances detail provisions for RVs. Travel-ready RVs, you can store a travel-ready RV in the floodplain as long as it's on wheels, it's highway ready, it's got those quick disconnects. But it's also something we want to keep an eye on, monitoring in that floodplain. Monitoring is a part of zoning administration in the floodplain. And RVs have a tendency to, establish permanence. Those wheels can sometimes disappear on us, and folks can have attached decks like what we see in this picture on the right. So it's just something that we want to keep an eye on in floodplain areas, because when these do get flooded, they have a tendency to just get destroyed completely. And these are people's homes, and we want to ensure that these are dry. A typical building permit process. The structure of this presentation, we're going to guide us through a typical permitting process, and we're going to use a building as an example. And a typical process is, a person would come into our office and they would want to develop a property, and we want to guide them through the process. Are they in the floodplain? Once we determine that they're in the floodplain, we want to verify what floodplain district they're in. We want to dig into our ordinance and ensure that the project's meeting ordinance standards. And then we work through the permit application process. We review that permit and we issue that permit, and our work isn't done there. Floodplain also involves inspections, and it requires documentation. So we're going to dig into each of these 5 steps in greater detail as we go along. Like I said, so are they in the floodplain? And like I said, a resident has come into City Hall and they've inquired about building down by the lake or the river. And, our first step is just to figure out where it is and whether our floodplain ordinance applies. So we need to know our maps and how to find them. And this is going to be different in every community. The site here, our Find Flood Map site, it contains a few different tutorials for viewing and downloading maps. We can see on this page, you can click on that expandable map. It gets a little bigger. But you can see the different types of flood maps in each county. And some counties were mapped and some communities were mapped in the early parts of the National Flood Insurance Program in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. A lot of those maps were done, I don't want to say crudely, but when you look at those maps, they were printed on paper. You don't see them over an aerial photo background. You have to get out your ruler and scale it out. And, contrast that to flood maps that are done more recently. They're done digitally. You can access them online through FEMA's Map Service Center site. You can see it over an aerial photo background. The floodplains clearly follow contour lines, and they're just a little bit more accurate. We can see on this map, we see these pink lines, and there's a lot of them, and there's more and more, and this is a data set that we're going to continue to grow. All of those pink lines identify locations in the state where we have what's called estimated 1% base flood elevations. And those are just what I said, estimated 1% flood elevations, estimated BFEs. So we have two types of mapped areas. We have our detailed study areas, our zones AE, or it might be an A with a number on it, and then just A, zone A. And those zone A areas make up the vast majority of our mapped floodplain in the state. And there's no associated data that goes along with that. If you look at an official flood map, you do not see in an A zone, you do not see the floodway and the flood fringe, and you do not see any kind of base flood elevations. These pink lines, this pink line data set, this offers estimated 100-year flood elevations for those A zones. So it's this type of data that we can make in a much more cost-effective way than doing an official mapping process through FEMA. And that's the reason why we're expanding this data set specifically. So if you have these pink lines, it's really important that you know how to access them, because they're really good for obtaining your best available data. So one such place to access that is on our lake and flood elevations online. Historically, the only place where you could get your official flood maps or your maps is through FEMA's Map Service Center site. And FEMA's Map Service Center site, I mean, though that's where you go to get your official maps, it's not really the most user-friendly map in the world. It's not the most user-friendly way to get a map. And it also doesn't identify those pink lines, or it doesn't identify our best available contour elevation. And this is all information that we need as zoning administrators to get the best data that's out there. Our lake and flood elevations online viewers are our attempt to bring all that relevant data all to the same location. So it's more user-friendly than Map Service Center. Like I said, it's got those 2-foot contours throughout the state on it. It's got lake elevations where we have lake elevation information. It's got those pink lines, those estimated 1% flood elevations. And then, you also see in the legend on the screen, it says unmodernized floodplain. Those are where we have those older paper maps. And the majority of those older paper maps have been digitized. I think with just only a couple of exceptions. There might be a couple of counties where it's not digitized, but at one point we've taken those old paper maps and digitized them so you can view them over an aerial photo background. And that's what's so great about this lake and flood elevations online, is that it brings all of those different sources together. If I was given this presentation just like 3 years ago before this came out, I would have been talking about the different places you can go to find all of these different things. And I think it was kind of confusing to a lot of folks. And long story short, if you haven't familiarized yourself with this site, I would encourage you to do so. So now that we've found our map, we want to evaluate its accuracy. And there's a lot of situations where the floodplain is mapped poorly. It might be an A zone that was mapped without any kind of detailed modeling, like A zones have a tendency to be, or it was mapped before we had LiDAR flown, so it was mapped before we had an accurate representation of those contour lines. Lots of times the maps, when they were originally delineated, they used 10-foot USGS contour maps, so though it was very difficult to get very good delineations using those old 10-foot contours. And that was the best data we have. And I guess you should make a point to learn your maps and compare them to the contour elevations well enough to know whether your floodplain boundaries accurately align with those true ground contours. So a couple of examples here. We see on our screen, we see this mapped floodplain, which clearly doesn't follow contours. And we have a property owner that wants to develop in this site right here. It's outside the floodplain, but you can clearly see that it's low. If this was mapped today, this probably would have been mapped in. It's obviously an at-risk site. Alternatively, we have this site here, which is on a ridge, but it's been incorrectly mapped in. And really, both of these sites, we have the ability to apply our floodplain ordinance to them, and we should be. And the reason is because we have a rule provision that accommodates for this type of poor mapping, And it says where a conflict exists between the floodplain limits illustrated on the official zoning map and the actual field conditions, the flood elevation shall be the governing factor in locating the regulatory floodplain limit. And that's been incorporated into our model ordinance for as long as the floodplain management program has been around in Minnesota. So you have a provision like this in your ordinance too. And that gives you the tools to apply your ordinance in those areas that might be just outside the mapped floodplain areas, but which should actually be mapped in. So let's do the same type of evaluation on another site. This is another A zone, with no floodway delineated, no flood elevations. We've looked on our official flood map, and this is what it looks like. We don't see a floodway, we don't see flood elevations. There's no contours or nothing. But we get a property owner that wants to build in or next to that A zone. Now, we can't issue a permit until we verify the boundaries of the floodplain, and we must stay out of the floodplain entirely until that's done. And that's a good thing because there's a certain level of unknown risk around these A zone areas. So a typical process, if I was a zoning administrator and I was confronting this property owner, number one, are they in the floodplain? And to determine that, we need to know the base flood elevations. So this happens to be a site where we have our pink line data set. Though we didn't see our flood elevations on our official FEMA mapped floodplain, our official FEMA floodplain map, we can open lake and flood elevations online and see our pink lines. So, here's a site, and we can see that it's between BFE's cross sections of 1310.5 and 1310.2. We're going to call our base flood elevation the upstream cross section, 1310.5. And we're going to compare that to the contours. So it looks like in our location, it's looking like the floodplain pretty closely follows the contours here. So this is a location where the floodplain is delineated pretty accurately. That's a good thing. So this is an accurate representation of the floodplain. So we're comparing our base flood elevation to the contours. They match up. So they can build outside of what's mapped, and they're outside the floodplain. The floodplain ordinance doesn't apply. If we can convince these property owners to do that, stay outside the floodplain, it's going to be a much simpler permitting process. They're reducing risk. It's a good thing. Everybody's happy. It doesn't always work out that way. Folks like building as close to that water as possible. And in this situation, it might be in the shoreland district. So if we have a shoreland ordinance in our community, that shoreland ordinance, if we look at the image on our right, along rivers and streams, that extends 300 feet landward of the ordinary high water level. In this situation, the floodplain is narrower than that 300 feet, so the shoreland might extend outside that mapped floodplain. Minimum elevations still apply in these areas throughout the shoreland area, even when the floodplain is shown to be a little bit narrower. Shoreland minimum elevations apply in unmapped areas entirely. And like I said, in those situations where the floodplain is narrow. So the graphic on the left is kind of a depiction of what we just saw. if you might be on the shore side, clearly in the floodplain, and that's representative of the house on the right. You know, clearly in the floodplain regulations apply, minimum elevations apply. They have to elevate that lowest floor above the RFPE. The house on the left is outside the floodplain, but still within shoreland. Minimum floor elevations still apply for this house as well. If they want to dig a basement, they can't dig that basement below the RFPE. The great thing about this standard is that when water bodies are mapped by FEMA at some point down the road, this standard ensures that our structures are built high and dry above that 100-year flood elevation. And I mean, this ensures that our building stock is protected. It eliminates the requirement for residents to have to carry a flood insurance policy when they're later mapped into the floodplain. This has been a very good and successful standard for Minnesota. So we verified that our site is in the floodplain, and next we have to determine the floodplain district. And your ordinance should be set up in a way where it details these different districts. We have a floodway district, a flood fringe district, and then we have something that's called a general floodplain district. If your community has A zones or areas that do not have a floodway delineated, you have a general floodplain district in your ordinance. So we're determining what district our site is. And if we're in a detailed study area where the floodway and flood fringe are clearly delineated on a map, this is typically easy. You know, here, this is a digital map, and we have one example situation. This is a person that wants to develop in this location. This is a backwater situation. It's clearly outside that fast moving water, well away from the floodway. This is under our floodplain ordinance. This is in flood fringe, which is permissive. Basically, any kind of use is allowed in flood fringe. But you can see it's a wetland, and it would likely trigger other wetland restrictions. So, I mean, building here isn't necessarily going to be clearly easy. You know, we always want to be aware of other standards that might apply, whether it be wetland or shoreland. Another example, what district is this in? So this is in 500-year floodplain. It's outside the 100-year floodplain. You know, it's outside the floodway. Flood fringe doesn't extend outside the floodway in this location, but the 500-year does. And if your ordinance regulates the 500-year floodplain, this would be considered to be flood fringe. If you don't regulate 500-year floodplain, really this information is just for flood risk communication purposes only. I mean, yes, it's allowed, but if somebody wants to build here, as a zoning administrator, it's really important to clearly communicate the risk that they're taking on by building in this location. And then this third example is on the edge of the floodway. You know, at this scale, we can't exactly see where the limits of the construction would be, where the limits of the footprint of the building would be, where the limits of the earth moving activities would be. Here we want to be very sure of the floodplain boundaries, and we just want to be looking at it a little bit closer. Let's do another example. Let's go back to the same site, and let's say the same person, they don't want to stay out of the floodplain, and we can't convince them otherwise. They want to build as close to that stream, and shoreland setback requirements allow them to do just that. Well, our ordinance allows them to build within the floodplain if this is an A zone, but a process must be followed to do that. Again, since this is an A zone, the floodway is not delineated. This is within the general floodplain district. And in order for them to build there, we have to verify that they are going to be outside of the floodway. And your ordinance should detail a process for that. In our most recent model ordinance, this is contained in section 7.2 and 7.3 of our model ordinance. Older versions of our model ordinance, and those on the call probably have an ordinance that's based off an older version of our model ordinance. This could be clear. But by and large, what your ordinance says is something very similar than what's on my screen here. And that involves determining an elevation. That is always required when you're in an A zone of some sort. Again, that's not going to be on map service center, but if you're in an area with those pink lines, that might be available through our lake and flood elevations online. You have to do an encroachment analysis. Since this is an A zone, a no rise requirement doesn't apply. In A zones, you're actually allowed some level of rise, no more than a half a foot, as long as no other flood damages would result. And increased flood damages, our interpretation of that is you can't cause any rise if it's going to flood out a neighboring house. So though your ordinance allows a half a foot of rise, it's important to look at what other houses around there might be affected by it. And so you might be limited further, so that would limit your ability to bring in fill, for instance. And then we need to determine our floodway boundaries. And if there's earth moving, if it's earth moving and only earth moving, then we don't necessarily have to delineate the floodway. However, in this case, we're building a house and we need to make sure that it's not in the floodway. So, traditionally, we to do that, you can hire an engineer, or that property owner can hire an engineer, and they can delineate the floodway for you. Then our rules accommodate for other acceptable methods, and those other acceptable methods have to be approved by the DNR. Some of those are written into an ordinance, which I'll get into. There might be some straightforward scenarios where the DNR can take a look at the hydraulics and simply draw a floodway line for the local community. Around lakes, we have language that allows all lands above the ordinary high water level to be treated as flood fringe, so long as disturbances in that nearshore area are minimized. Now, if you're right next to an inlet or an outlet, it might require further analysis. There's also those backwater situations where we don't have velocities and flows. We could draw a floodway line in those situations to clearly show that it's outside the floodway. Situations where it's upstream or downstream of a bridge, the hydraulics in these locations is very predictable and can help guide those floodway boundaries. I think next Monday, SEAL has a special training on A zones, the 13th. And so if you're a community with a lot of A zones, I would encourage you to attend that presentation, and she'll dig more into these concepts at that presentation. So we verified the sites in the floodplain. We verified what district it's in. Now we need to dig into our ordinance and make sure that it meets our ordinance standards. So our ordinance guides uses. The ordinance will talk about permitted uses and conditional uses. The floodway is very restrictive in the types of uses that are allowed in the floodway. If we're in the floodway, only so many things are allowed there. Flood fringe, broadly, anything is allowed, more or less, with some exceptions there. Then once we determine that it's allowed, is it a basic permit or does it require a CUP? And these things are pretty clearly detailed in your ordinance. There's requirements that apply to all development. All development must be anchored. You must use flood resistant materials. There must be adequate drainage, not detrimental to adjoining areas. You don't want to flood out your neighbors. Utilities must be above or flood proof to the RFPE. There's also a provision for storage of materials. Nothing that's flammable, explosive, injurious, or likely to cause pollution. That provision, that last bullet's been written slightly different than the most recent version of our model to more closely mirror what's in rule, as well as accommodate for those types of projects that would require PC8 permitting. So it accommodates for exceptions provided they meet the requirements established by Pollution Control Agency. But we're building a house. And there's two methods to build a house in the flood fringe. And that's you can elevate on fill, and that's a basic permit. And there's alternatives to fill. And anything that doesn't meet the fill standards requires a CUP. To build on fill, and Seal had gotten into this in the floodplain basics presentation, so I'll kind of breeze through this. We see those two horizontal lines, and the distance between them is a little exaggerated, but you know, the bottom one's the base flood elevation, and then the top one's the RFPE. And the house on the right, let's take a look at the house on the right. We see that the top of the fill, it doesn't extend all the way up to that RFPE line. It must be no lower than 1 foot below the RFPE. And above that fill, we have a concrete pad. And, you know, in most cases, you probably have floor joists above that. And then, I guess, either way, the walking surface of that first floor must be at or above the RFPE. We also see our fill extending beyond the footprint of the house. And for residential structures, that fill pad is required to be at or above the BFE within 15 feet of that building footprint. So according to our rules, any residential building construction that doesn't meet any part of that fill requirement, it must be processed as a CUP. So we put these graphics in our new model ordinance, and this highlights a few of the different types of elevation methods that would be alternative to fill. You know, on our left, we see a filled stem wall. That's just a foundation, and you put fill inside that foundation, put a slab on top of that, and that's something that you're looking at. It could be a variation of that one on the left, where you can't extend your fill 15 feet, so you want to put a retaining wall on one side short of that 15 feet. That would kind of fall into some variation of the graphic on the left. The graphic on the middle is those types of situations where you have flood vents. And so you have flood openings, and it's a raised crawl space, you know, so it's like an above grade crawl space where that crawl space is above the natural grade, and then you have your walking surface above that. So those vents, when a floodwaters come in, those vents allow the floodwaters to freely flow beneath that lowest floor. The graphic on the right is like piers or pilings or posts, or on those coastal areas, sometimes you see them on something that looks like stilts. And again, if it's a residential structure, our rules say that all of these require a CUP. And it's kind of unfortunate because it just adds a little bit more red tape and delay and, you know, typically fees. And I guess the idea behind the CUP requirement is that there's a little bit more oversight because of the additional building standards that are triggered. Those would be guided by FEMA technical bulletins. Technical bulletin 1 details a lot of the alternative elevation methods that must be followed. And these alternatives to fill are reasonable, and we like to promote them because the alternative is putting a bunch of fill in our floodplains, which have environmental impacts. And you know, let's like the example I talked about. Let's say you have a narrow lot and you can't extend your fill 15 feet. This is a very reasonable alternative. Or let's say you have a situation where the natural ground is well below RFPE, and the amount of fill that you would need to bring in is extremely cost prohibitive. And this might make the options in the center and the right side of the screen a little bit more appealing. Definition of lowest floor, just real quick, the lowest floor, the lowest enclosed area, including basement. And then your definition will have a second sentence that relates strictly to those alternative elevation methods. And that creates an exception to the that first sentence. And it's basically saying if you have flood vents and you're utilizing those alternative building elevations, the lowest floor would not be that lowest enclosed area. So we talked about primary structures. These are accessory structures, and they're real quick. There's 2 primary methods to develop an accessory structure. That's the first is, and the most common is through wet flood proofing. That enables the accessory structure to be inundated. You've installed flood vents, and you're accommodating for that structure to be inundated during a flood event. When you build that way, you're only limited to structures that are less than 576 square feet. That's the size of a 2-car garage. And within those areas, they can only be used for parking and storage. You can build a larger accessory structure on fill, but if you're going to utilize those wet flood proofing methods, the only way to do it would be through a variance, and think about like a large ag structure, for instance, using the amount of fill to get a large ag structure above the RFP might not be possible. So that might be a type of situation where we see a variance allowing wet flood proofing, but for a larger structure. Those would be one of the few situations that we would ever see a variance in floodplain. Visually, this is a wet flood proofed accessory structure. We can see that we have our flood openings. We have elevated utilities above the RFPE. They meet the standards that apply to every other type of development in the floodplain. It must be anchored. It must have flood resistant materials, that sort of thing. Accessory structures are challenging for zoning administrators. A lot of these have a tendency to get built without a permit. And on the screen, some may call these accessory structures, but there's something wrong with each of these. On the left, we have a duck blind, and it's right next to shore, as they tend to be. And in this example, it's likely in the floodway and not an allowable use. And there's good reason for that. And they have a tendency to get washed away during a flood event or plug up culverts downstream. And I understand that these are all over the state, but they're just not permittable. I would suggest these hunters consider a temporary blind. The middle one may have been a shed at one time, but now it's a full-on habitable dwelling. And we've got our Airbnbs, and they're very lucrative. And these types of rehabs are becoming more and more common. This is an issue both for floodplain as well as shoreland. On the rights and outhouse, our floodplain ordinances have standards for sewage treatment systems and other service facilities. We don't want these in floodplain. And they're tough. They're tough to permit. You might not have a permit process for them, but when it's floodplain, they just need to be scrutinized more. So we've done all of our analysis, and now it's time to issue our permit. This gives us an opportunity to communicate with a property owner. It's important to communicate flood risk and alternatives with the property owner. It's important to communicate implications for flood insurance with that property owner. This is our chance to steer the property owner to different local contacts, a surveyor, engineer, architect that we might have experience with that can help guide a property owner through that process. If you're utilizing our floodplain permit application form, you can help complete that permit application form together. And this is where you also want to encourage the completion of an elevation certificate, a formal FEMA elevation certificate. And there's reasons for that, and I'm going to get into that later. But that's one form of an as-built that we really should start thinking about more and more. Our permit application form, let's dig into this a little bit. This is, I believe, from the 3rd page of our 5-pager, our full permit application form. So our 5-pager, the first 2 pages are filled out by the applicant, and then this 3rd page here is filled out by the floodplain administrator. This top section is where we detail our flood zone and our RFPE determination. We verified that they're in the floodplain district that they're in. Is it a permitted use? Is it a CUP? And then we identify our base flood elevation. We identify our stage increase that we found from the flood insurance study or otherwise. We identify the freeboard that's in our ordinance to come up with our RFP. And in this case, it's 1092.3. We've identified the datum that it's in. as well as the source of where we found that BFE. The bottom section is for when we have building construction. This is where we're identifying the required elevation for the structure and what is required. You know, the top of the bottom floor, including basements or crawl space. The top of the next highest floor, that would be applicable if we're utilizing those alternative elevation methods. Elevation of an attached garage, if we have an attached garage. We identify the lowest elevation of the electrical, gas, ductwork, lowest adjacent grade, fill elevation 15 feet from building. This communicates to the property owner that these elevations are required. When this is complete, the property owner knows exactly what elevations they have to meet, and it's documentation for the file. I think it's the 4th page that details relevant requirements for non-conforming structures. So if it's an alteration of an existing structure, it requires us to do some evaluations, documenting costs. You know, so we're documenting the cost of the improvements or repair. We have to identify a number. We also compare that number to the market value of the structure, and we have to determine what that market value is. And we have a process, a recommended process for doing that, and that's detailed a little further along in this presentation. But we have to compare the two, cost of the project to market value, and ensure that it's less than 50% of the market value. So whether it's an improvement or repair, those costs can't be any more than 50% of the market value. And if it is, then they have to bring that structure into compliance. And if you're identifying all these numbers in the permit application form, this is your documentation. You can throw it in the file, have it there for the next time somebody applies for work on this structure. And that's important because a lot of folks have a provision in their ordinance for tracking alterations cumulatively over the life of the structure. And this offers a little bit of guidance for how you might track those improvements or damages cumulatively. Let's say in 2004, they had a new deck, and we did an evaluation and found that that deck improvement was 10% of the market value of the structure. Then in 2016, they did an addition, and that addition alone was 32% of the market value of the structure. But our ordinance requires cumulative evaluation. So, you know, we look at past deck improvements along with this, and they're still under that 50% threshold. They're at 42 now. So at this point, they're pretty limited in what more they can do with that structure beyond just basic maintenance. And then 2021 comes along and they want to add a sunroom. Well, they can't do that, because what they're proposing would then bring them over that 50% threshold if the community has adopted a cumulative non-conforming structure provision in their floodplain. And this permit application would guide them through that. We have a document on our website, Minnesota Post-Flood Substantial Damage Playbook for local officials. This gets into how a zoning administrator would evaluate those costs with a little bit more detail, and how to determine project costs. You know, you want that property owner to obtain a cost estimate from a contractor. That's the easiest way. And then market value of the structure. Your assessor will probably have an assessment ratio, you know, so you have an assessed value and then an assessment ratio, and your county assessor would have a recommendation for determining a market value of a structure. This document gets into that a little bit more. And if it's a repair, I mean, just be prepared. If you have a flood event, you're going to get inundated with permitting demands. People want to fix their houses and fix their houses immediately. And if you're a zoning administrator in a floodplain area that has a tendency to flood, you want to establish a process. And I would encourage you to think about that before your flood event ever comes. So we've issued our permit. Now we have inspections and as-builts. Not everybody has inspections typically in their community, but if it's floodplain, it's required. So just know that. And inspections, strongly encouraged. It's easier to correct the compliance issues early on in the project. And what this would typically involve is an early site visit. And you go on site, and typically what you would see is the surveyor has established a benchmark, and usually it's identified on a post or some lathe. And you want to verify that they're using that benchmark to shoot their grades and base their lowest floor on. And all those other required elevations, you want to ensure that they have some kind of a benchmark on site where they're basing all of their elevations from. You also want to ensure that what they're building is what you've permitted, that there's not any other kind of modifications that you haven't okayed. And then once everything is all complete, there's as-builts, and as-builts are required. And if a surveyor is out there shooting grades for development, that property owner should also be working with that surveyor to complete a FEMA elevation certificate. If they're getting a flood insurance policy, they're going to need a flood elevation certificate. If they need to get a letter or map amendment, they need to get a flood elevation certificate. And with risk rating 2.0, we can't recommend flood elevation certificates strongly enough. Most folks are getting better flood insurance rates if they have that FEMA elevation certificate. So also, while you're on site, you also want to be taking pictures, and those pictures can be used for the file for the future as well. I know I'm running out of time, but I just have a few more slides left. Inspections and as-builts. Here we are again with the FEMA elevation certificate. It's used for insurance. If you're a CRS community, which is a FEMA program that awards communities for higher standards, implementing administrative best practices, they can get residents a better rate on their insurance policy if they're a CRS community. CRS communities have to use FEMA elevation certificates for as-builts. Like I said, letters of map change, a FEMA elevation certificate is required too. Common permitting oversights, not keeping elevation documentation, not enforcing floodplain regulations when the site is incorrectly mapped out of the floodplain, not processing as a CUP when it's required, or not issuing a local permit in those situations where a DNR permit is required. And the most common legal challenge is when permitted development later causes damage to others. And just know, if you're following the regulations, the law is on your side. So never feel bad about rejecting a permit application. You know, sometimes as zoning administrators, we can get political pressure to accommodate development. Some communities are just desperate for development, but as long as you're following your ordinance, you have the reassurance that you're following the law. So, and there's very few variance opportunities. So, you know, we want to ensure that we're adhering to the floodplain requirements. A few other administrative considerations, floodway developments. Like I said, uses in the floodway are very restrictive. Buildings, the only types of buildings that are allowed in the floodway are buildings that are accessory to certain types of uses, like a park shelter, or if you have aggregate mining, you might have the need for like a very small structure or something like that. Very few exceptions for that requirement. Just by and large, no buildings in the floodway. And then any grading, filling, obstruction that must demonstrate a no rise, 0.0 feet during a 100-year event. So if you're moving dirt, you have to get a no rise certificate. And if you can't demonstrate no rise, you have to get an official FEMA map revision, a letter of map revision. How no rise is demonstrated? The developer has to engage an engineer and an engineer has to complete a no-rise certification. Or our law also accommodates for standard engineering practices. So when there's earth moving activities in the floodway, but those earth moving activities are returning that soil to to the grade that was there previously, then that's really the only type of situation that a no-rise certification wouldn't be required. Culvert replacement, that's one of our most common activities in the floodway. A local permit is waived when it's approved through a DNR permit. There's situations where no DNR permit is required, like if it's a map floodplain, but it's not a public water, well, then a local permit is required. DNR also has deregulated public waters, like those public waters that drain less than 5 square miles. We aren't issuing DNR permits for those, but a local permit would still be required in those situations. Then there's also the allowance for replacement of like size, type, and elevation culverts, just straight up culvert replacements, like for like. That's allowed, but it still requires a local permit. And, you can think about streamlining those in any way you'd like to reduce the burden, but a local permit is required nonetheless. So visually, we see that this is a floodplain, and we see our blue line is a public water, and the polygon is the mapped floodplain. And we have a culvert going over here, and this obviously requires a DNR permit in these situations. And then we have a culvert going over the road here, going under the road here, and a DNR permit wouldn't be required in this situation because it's not a public water, but a local permit is required. And, again, this is just repeating the applicable standards. You can't increase the flood stages more than a half a foot. And that has to be determined by somebody. It has to be determined by an engineer or other accepted engineering practices. And really, I don't know what that would involve, but if you're going to entertain any kind of other accepted engineering practices, you would have to engage the DNR. And I mean, by and large, that would be like for like. Unless you're doing something besides like for like, it would require engineering evaluation. Another plug for our floodplain culverts. If you're going to talk culverts, it's a good time to consider floodplain culverts. If you're replacing a culvert, there was probably something wrong with your original culvert. So this would be an opportunity to consider enhancements. And we've been pitching our floodplain culverts to stabilize streams for water quality, and there's a process for it. We have a ton of resources on our website, but here's just a few that I'm pitching right now. Obviously, your ordinance. And then we have all sorts of tools on our website that I've already introduced us to today. Floodplain training and education page. We have recorded trainings. This training here will get recorded and we'll post this online. We have last year's version of this training posted online as well. A plug for our quick guide, our floodplain management quick guide. This is a little bit more visually stimulating than a floodplain ordinance. And it can, it's a way to show common types of floodplain developments a little bit more visually. And I would encourage local zoning administrators to familiarize themselves with that. We already talked about lake and flood elevations online. And I'm out of time, so thank you for your time. And with that, I'll leave it for questions.